My partner and I believe that social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, etc. have fundamentally changed modern society. That's why we are able to support the resolution this House believes in social media. This is clearly a fact resolution. We're debating about whether or not this statement is true or not. We'd like to define this House's advocacy of the room, so if you all here in the room believe at the end of the round that social media has fundamentally changed society, you should vote for the up. If you don't believe that, you should vote for the op. And we're going to define believe in as had a fundamental impact or change. The way we're going to structure this round is we're going to bring up 5 separate contentions. Each of the contentions will involve a different sphere of society. And if you believe that any of those particular spheres have been fundamentally changed, you believe that social media has had a fundamental impact on this round. The round we give to the opposition team and the negative team in this round is to argue that these changes are merely superficial and are not fundamental in nature, or contrariwise, they have been caused by something else besides social media. That being said, let's start on our first of the spheres that we're going to be dealing with in today's round, is that of interpersonal relations. We think that the way people relate to one another has been fundamentally affected by social media. There are a number of ways it's done this. The first, people can now be more distant from each other without feeling a type of distance. You can live on the opposite side of the country from your wife and still be very, very close to her, knowing what's going on in her life through the use of social media. Secondly, you don't have to meet people who are just geographically local to you in the way you would have in the old days. Now you can meet people anywhere in the world on the basis of solely your interests. So your friend group is no longer constrained by geographical interests. Thirdly, people can now be cyberbullied in ways they couldn't be in the past. Recent studies have shown that people today are cyberbullied just as much as they're physically bullied. What's the fundamental difference between cyberbullying and normal bullying? It can be much more cruel because you separate the perpetrators from the consequences of their actions. Since they never have to face retribution from school or from their bosses, they can just pick on people and bully them. The second way cyberbullying is fundamentally different is you can't escape it. In real life, you can go home from your school or home from your work and be away from the bullying. However, online, which everyone's life is currently all online, you can be hunted down and tracked and targeted across various social media platforms where you can't escape from it. Fourthly and finally, the way our interpersonal relationships have changed is we're no longer concerned with privacy. We're no longer interested in keeping certain facts about ourselves private. Instead, we broadcast them on the internet for everybody to see. The second sphere that has fundamentally changed because of social media is that of the economy. There are a number of ways that the economy has been fundamentally affected. The first is that marketing is now direct. We market directly to individual people as opposed to on a broad scale with things like newspaper ads or television advertisements. We can target and mold those ads, catering them to a specific individual and their wants and needs versus just guessing at what will appeal to the greatest number of people. So point B under here is that we can now gather information and target people through media. So we can know what those individual people like, and things they like and other things. Thirdly, you opt in or opt out to the advertisements that come to you. You don't simply get them the way you used to when you watch TV and commercials. You choose by liking the Doritos page or by liking the Mountain Dew page to receive advertisements and deals from them. Fourthly, it's fundamentally changed the way labor works in society, because now when you're going to go get a job, your boss is going to check with you on Facebook in order to find out more about you. So hiring practices have fundamentally changed because bosses are now interested in your personal life and the way you are outside of work because they can be. Fifthly and finally, under the way it's changed the economy, is funding is now able to be disintermediated. Instead of going to a bank and convincing the bank that people want the product that you have and get a loan from the bank, you can now post on Facebook, hey guys, I'm starting this new crowdfunding campaign. If you're interested in this product, come over here and give me money directly. This allows funding to be done more efficiently, and it fundamentally changes the way we do it. Now, instead of putting together a business plan that's designed in order to communicate financial security and fundamentals of your business being strong, now more people are more likely to know the snappy part of it, the part that's likely to appeal to mass audiences versus people who are interested in the financial nitty-gritty details. Third major thing that we've changed is the way the media works. So the media has changed in a number of particular ways. One, we don't just get our media from one source anymore. Even when the internet existed, before social media, we go to foxnews.com or we go to CNN.com. Now we just go to Facebook and we have all of these different news pages liked, and so we get our news from a bunch of different sources, which allows there to be more competing sources and allows us to get a broader range of viewpoints as opposed to just one the way we used to. Secondly, news bites tend to become shorter so they can be put in a Facebook post and you can get the general gist of the article as opposed to other things. So instead of getting more depth, you get more breadth. You get more viewpoints and you get more ideas, but you don't get, you get less depth. Thirdly, it's allowed media to be provided in this intermediate way. People can find out about something in their local neighborhood and post it on the news, being the person to break the news themselves instead of some sort of media source. So now instead of journalists being the fundamental people who come up with news stories or see them, it's just people taking videos with their cameras and so forth. Finally, we get information faster. It used to be that we got information day to day, Originally it was week to week. You wouldn't hear about something until like a week or a month had passed. Then we got things like the newspaper, and then we got the newspaper every morning, and we received information on a day-to-day period. We considered time period periods of days. Then later, we got the idea of hour-to-hour time periods by watching the daily news. We'd go home, we'd go to work, we'd work all day, then we'd come back home, and then we consider time in blocks of hours. Now, when we have our phones up almost all the time and see social media, we consider time from moment to moment. The fundamental way we perceive time has been changed by social media. The fourth general sphere we want to look up is that of politics. We fundamentally changed politics with social media by one, making grassroots campaigning easier, right? You can just go to all of these individual people as opposed to doing other things. In the past, you had to do stuff like ads in the newspaper or debates and communicate to a whole bunch of people at once. Now, you can do grassroots campaigning much easier, get people to do stuff in their particular communities by targeting them specifically. You can see this in a number of examples. One is President Obama totally slaughtered everybody else on Facebook, on MySpace. He did an AMA on Reddit. He had more followers on Twitter than anybody else, and he got elected in large part because of his ability to do grassroots politicking through social media. Secondly, you see fundamental changes in the way politics in the Middle East and national security have worked. You can organize protests, and you can organize even types of attacks on a government through social media in a more efficient way than you could in the past. And you've also seen the way national security has changed by looking at these types of things and using them as a primary means for gathering information and the decreasing privacy. The final sphere we have is that of education. I believe we've fundamentally changed the way people think through social media by causing us to think in terms of networks of people and groups of friends, as opposed to just they're my friend or they aren't. We've also changed the way people think because they're now thinking, like we said earlier, in shorter bursts. They're thinking not in terms of big long articles, but in terms of snippets and snippets. At the end of the day, we think that the way we relate to other people, the way we relate to the economy, the way we relate to the national media, the way we relate to politics, or the way we're educated in today's world through things like images instead of books and text, have been fundamentally changed by the advent of social media. And for that reason, we think that it's clear that you too should believe in social media. Thank you.
So I'm put in a very difficult position given the resolution and the argumentation presented by the government team. And all the argumentation I'm going to be outlining in this speech is going to be fairly technical. The problem with the resolution presented is that it's not only incomplete, but the interpretation the government team has chosen is also improper, unfair, and wrong for a bunch of different reasons. This House believes in social media structures a debate in a intellectually harmful and just a disadvantageous structure for all the participants as well as for the art of the debate itself, which leads me to three main pieces of argumentation. First, the counter structure this resolution should be interpreted as a value resolution. The second piece of argumentation under the government's interpretation that is a truism. And then the third, an overall resolutional critique arguing for how this debate should have more appropriately been structured and how the resolution should have been, or a different resolution should have been chosen. So jumping into the value resolution, counter-interpretation at first. The government team chose to interpret this as a fact resolution. This is problematic for several reasons. The first one is, you can label the first one as the phrase believes in. This has three subpoints, but the phrase believes in automatically renders this resolution as a value resolution. The first reason is that believes in requires a weighing mechanism in the resolution. All resolutions with the phrase believes in are automatically categorized as value because the belief rather than action or reality requires a conflict between values. The second reason is grammar. The grammar of the resolution, sure.
If we wanted to debate something like whether or not we believe Donald Trump will be president, would that be a fact or a value?
That would be a value resolution because it's something that's not yet happened. It's not reality. Belief is outside of reality. It's not a fact that's indisputable. It's something that requires opinions and subjective reasoning, essentially. The second reason, after it requires a weighing or value conflict, is grammar. Grammar signifies, or the grammar of this resolution, the believes in phrase, again, signifies an intangible identification to an idea. The idea of social media or something that it represents, rather than the noun itself of social media venues. The third is normative language. 99.9% of debate resolutions that have the phrase believes in are categorized as value resolutions. It's normative debate practice to categorize this type of resolution as value. Now the second is the word uses. as their argumentation renders this resolution. They're trying to say that this House uses social media to, or culture has used social media to fundamentally change the economy, our social interaction, politics, all of these things. But uses does not equal believes. Uses is a physical manifestation of action, whereas believes is an immaterial type of entity without action. So that's the first reason why uses does not equal believes, because of the definitional conflict. The second is common man. One can believe in God, but one doesn't. It's just grammatically and logically incorrect to say that one uses God or uses some sort of belief, because then it transitions from the immaterial to the material, which is not a value resolution. So this resolution requires value, sure.
But we're not debating whether or not people have used social media, because clearly they have. We're debating whether or not we believe social media has changed things fundamentally. I didn't use the word use once in there. Do we or do we not believe that social media has fundamentally changed things?
Right, what you just said the exact same thing twice, that society has used social media to fundamentally change the economy, politics, our social interactions, cyberbullying, privacy, all of these things. The second piece of argumentation is a truism. Not only is their rendering of this resolution as a fact it is a truism. Basically, it's something that's an indisputable fact. It's a reality that cannot be argued with. There's three subpoints into this that I want to make. First, he uses as a fact. Whether or not, or if he wants to choose any other word, it doesn't matter. But the fact that society has used social media, or social media has changed society in all of these different ways, is an indisputable fact. There's no contest. There's universal agreement that the economy, politics, social interaction, all of these things have been fundamentally changed because of social media. There's universal disagreement as to whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, but there's no disagreement as to whether or not it's actually happened. It's a fact. There's no point in debate, and it's unfair for the negative team to be forced to argue against a reality. There needs to be some sort of room for a conflicting viewpoint or conflicting fact to be entered in this debate when, as we see, the interpretation that they've adopted leaves no room for that whatsoever. There's three impacts that come from this. First, negative ground. Again, there's no negative ground conceivable in a debate round that argues against reality, because we're arguing about whether or not these things have changed, and every single one of the justifications and subpoints under the justifications given by the government team have shown that all of these things are in fact true. There's no contest. No one argues that social media has not fundamentally changed politics or the economy or social interaction. It just does not exist. The second impact is educational value. There's no learning from arguing against reality. We're not arguing here about whether or not social media is a good thing. We're saying, has social media changed the world in which we live in, which is an indisputable fact. We don't learn anything. There's no expansion or confliction of ideas. No one learns anything. And the third impact is a time waste, especially in a practice round for debate. The idea here is to practice the art of entering conflicting ideas and seeing which one at the end of the day can result in being the superior idea. Whereas what we're forced with, because of the interpretation adopted by the government team, is arguing against reality with an anti-reality, an immaterial reality that simply doesn't exist. So there's no educational value, there's no negative ground to argue upon, it's a complete time waste. Now the third piece of argumentation is a resolutional critique. Given the fact that they've adopted the wrong interpretation, since this round should be set up as a value resolution, and the fact that the fact interpretation itself is a truism, forcing us to argue against a universally accepted reality, the resolution itself is also inadequate. The link here is that the resolution frames a debate for value, as we've seen in the phrase believes in and all of the subpoints that justify that interpretation. The brink here is that the government team needs to prove the value of a material object. They need to prove that there's some sort of immaterial inherent value in social media as an entity, rather than, or more appropriately, the immaterial effect of social media. Now there's one violation here. The violation is that there's no value presented. This has three internal violations. First, there's no value weighing mechanism, which is crucial for a resolution that demands something to be believed in and then that belief to be debated. There's no value weighing or conflict. Second, it's an incomplete wording of the resolution itself. This resolution should be scrapped along with all government argumentation because it's simply incomplete, as we're going to look at in our alternatives. This house believes in social media is just an illogical phrase that no one says this house or I believe in table. It's just a noun that something believes in. That's just a logical inconsistency. No one argues that way. Moreover, the third internal violation is that government rhetoric supports this framework. They're arguing about the beneficial change or the beneficial effects. They're arguing on a resolution that is assumed to have a more complete wording. This house believes in social media's effect on the economy, politics, social interaction, privacy, all of these things, rather than this house believes in social media. So even their argumentation argues for something that's more complete than the resolution we're given. That's the fundamental violation and why this resolution, along with all the argumentation, should be scrapped. Now the alternative is a more complete resolution. For example, this House believes in social media's ability to blank. This House believes in social media's inherent worth. This House believes in social media's negative effect on blank. That last one there is pretty much what the government team is arguing, but it's not the resolution presented. So because they're even arguing for a different resolution or assuming that we're operating under a different resolution, this round should automatically flow to the opposition because the resolution is imperfect and even their argumentation supports it. This kills the educational value of debate. We can't argue against reality. And there's no point in arguing against a resolutional topic that's incomplete in and of itself. For those reasons, vote opposition. Thank you.
Start off with, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today, especially and primarily you, the judge, for giving us your time and valuable input. Also, thank you to my partner for giving us a great case to debate today, and at the very least, thank you to my opponents for at least giving it a good shot in their first speech. So let's start off with what my opponents argued, and I think it stems out of a fundamental misunderstanding of what the resolution says, of the debate overall, and of what my partner and I have been saying. So let's start with the parts he was talking about overall. Part one was the value. Believes in, renders the value, so on and so forth. First of all, it depends on what the words mean, what the word believes in means, and it can mean many different things. When you say, I believe in God, that means, you know, it exists often. If you say believes Donald Trump will win, or I believe in this case, social media, you know, it means something entirely different. It doesn't just necessarily entail a value statement. My second point is it allows us to project something specific onto it. It's not something that's very specific. It allows us to have a lot of leeway in really analyzing this resolution and defining this resolution. And in this case, what he really should be looking at is how we define the resolution, whether it's abusive or not. And then, as I'll be talking about later, my partner really bent over backwards to give the negative team a lot of ground in this round, and that we shouldn't be punished for their inability to take the ground. The third point, again, that I already kind of touched on this, is believes in is a big term and allows us to define it many different ways. It doesn't merely entail value. He said it was a normative issue in debate. First of all, he has no way of knowing that because he's a limited frame of reference. Secondly, it doesn't matter. Thirdly, it's not true. Finally, he talked about, actually that's all I have across from there. The final point he brought up under this was that use does not equal belief. I have a few points here. First of all, we weren't talking about use, we were talking about the magnitude of impact that it's had. We weren't talking about, oh, society uses it. No, we were talking about the impact social media has on society, that social media has come into existence and changed the way society functions. So it's, again, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're talking about. And again, my partner gave him lots of ground in today's debate, gave them lots of arguments they could have made against this, but the fact that they didn't take it doesn't mean you should punish us for that. Let's look to the second point he brought up, the truism point. Again, you'll be hearing a lot of things I've said earlier coming up again. The point about it's impossible to debate this. Before I get into any specific points I have, I mean, we define this in a very reasonable way. We're debating today the impact social media has had on society and whether it's a significant turn versus a fad. And we gave you lots of specific points that were very easy to debate, where it's the economy or politics. You could have argued many different things. Again, my partner did all sorts of things to create a very fair round. We created a specific resolution analysis that fits with both the definition of the terms and also just the fairness of debate. So let's look at two specific points. First of all, well, actually, I said most of my points. First of all, my partner gave you tons of ground. Secondly, there's no reason for you to punish us over my opponent's inability to take the ground that they were given. Thirdly, we're not talking about whether or not it's happened or it exists. My opponent said that, and that's clearly wrong. We're not saying social media exists or the phenomenon has happened. We're talking about the irrevocable impact it's had on society in these specific spheres of life, each and every one of which is highly debatable, and it's disappointing to see all those points go uncontested in today's round. Fourthly, there are plenty of counter arguments I'll get to in a minute. Talking about my partner gave me that you could have run. I mean, I thought of plenty myself, but you could argue it's a fad. You could argue people still need non-social media things to function in their daily lives. You could argue about advertising being much more traditional news making a resurgence, things like that. Obama's campaign merely being a fad as well, and that politics being based on much more traditional things. Plenty of ground for you to argue, and it's ridiculous that I have to get up here and bring up arguments against my own case. Yes?
Yeah, can you give me just, we'll take your politics justification. Can you give me one alternative? I mean, you said it was ridiculous, some alternatives that we could have possibly argued. But more to the specific interpretation you adopted the resolution, can you give me one example of how social media did not have the significant effect that social media had on electing President Obama in the 2008 election?
Did you even hear the question you were asking? What impact did social media not have that social media had? That question doesn't even make sense.
Can I ask a follow-up?
If you want to.
So my understanding is that you're arguing social media has had X, Y, and Z effects on these areas. So explain to me how anything besides social media could have had the effect in X, Y, and Z areas that social media had.
Campaign finance laws, Citizens United decisions, demographics, youth involvement, any of those things. The fact that we're probably going to be largely Latino in a lot of areas of the country soon. I mean, the Citizens United decision already brought that up. That's just off the top of my head. The partner's smarter than me, you could probably think of plenty more. Fifthly, I'd like to turn the impact they brought up of educational value. And again, the fact is we're having a worthless debate today. I mean, regardless of whether it's not or not it's a practice round, we're having a worthless debate today because we're not discussing the pressing, interesting, impactful issues that my partner and I brought up today of economics, politics, society, interpersonal interactions. We're not debating any of those issues. Those are all definitely interesting issues to debate. We're not touching any of them. We're only dealing with today what ground the negative team has and why they haven't decided to use that. So let's look to the final issue of the resolution critique. I have a few points here. First of all, it's not really a resolutional critique, or at least most of it's not, but merely just a reiteration of the point about it should be good value. And secondly, this is a point I could have brought up earlier, but I didn't, but I want to bring it up now. It doesn't really impact today's debate. If he's so into the educational value, whether or not it's a value or a fact doesn't change the actual meat of the debate, if you assume we're defining it fairly otherwise. So disregard the point about the technical point about value versus fact, because if you assume his educational value point is valid, then that becomes beside the point. Thirdly, look to our resolutional analysis. It was very fair. We had a broad resolution. We could have defined it more narrowly. We defined it extraordinarily fairly, and we gave ourselves a very high burden. Look to what my partner said, and look at the burden he set for us. It was a stiff burden of defining whether or not, or deciding whether or not social media has had such an important impact. Look at the resolution analysis he gave. Thirdly, we gave them lots of ground in the round, and there's no reason for you to punish us because they were unwilling to take the ground. And finally, I already touched on this, but look at the common man definition of the term believes in. He talked about common man earlier, he talked about educational value earlier. Both of these, if you take those to the definition of believes in, there's many ways you can commonly use the term believes in, and we definitely fall under that. Their technical, narrow definition of believes in is ridiculous and should be thrown out of the round. We urge you to go with the team that's actually been debating the content in today's round and providing you with a better debate and definitely a far better structured case. Thank you.
think that a lot of the debate that has gone on today from both sides centers on this concept of what the meaning of believes in is. As my partner stated, believes in is commonly used as a value res, to which the Gov team responded, that's a limited frame of reference, he can't know that, and then immediately followed up by saying it's not true, to which I would counter, like my partner, the Gov team has a limited frame of reference, and thus to assert as fact that it is not true is a fallacy. We look at the common use of believes in, and one thing that the Gov forgot to point out, or didn't point out, in my opinion, is the preposition believes in. They brought up the point of if a so-called fact resolution might be, this House believes that Donald Trump will become president. I think it's important to note that that resolution, this House believes that, not this House believes in Donald Trump will become president. It doesn't make sense. Belief in something is much more typical of a value resolution, as my partner stated. The Gov said that they have given us a lot of leeway, but we weren't really able to prep for this because of the way that the resolution is designed. The resolution, as a value resolution, seems to give us or set up a debate that is on the value of social media, yet we don't have a specific value to discuss. Let's look at the second point.
On the issue of the value, what measurable difference would it have on their educational value to have a value versus a fact?
Value versus a fact resolution. It's a really good question. Legitimately have no idea. Moving on to the second point, which is that it is a truism. The resolution presented by the government team that that social media has fundamentally changed culture. I think that there is very little leeway in this description. If you look simply at crime, there are many new ways which people are using social media to commit different crimes. We look at the Middle East, where social media was used to organize revolts. It's hard to, and I would argue, nearly impossible to argue that social media has not fundamentally changed at least one of these spheres. This leaves us once again in a bind as the op team, as we are arguing an indisputable fact. We have to argue something that's really impossible to argue. Looking at our critique, we didn't hear much on the alternatives we presented. one alternative way to phrase this debate would be, this House believes that social media has fundamentally changed culture. That would seem to more naturally fit the government's position. However, this isn't the res that we were given. Some impacts of the lack of value in the resolution is that we aren't able to prepare for a value. Because there's no value given in the res. And as my partner stated, it is unfortunate that we now have a universal agreement that this has been a wasted round. But I think, as me and my partner have shown, the interpretation of the resolution isn't valid, or the interpretation that the Gov has given us isn't a valid interpretation, given the use of believes, specifically believes in, and their definition that believes in means that it's fundamentally changed culture, which is, as we've shown, a truism.
All right, this rather disappointing round has boiled down on the negative side, or the opposition side of argumentation, into two things. Before I do that, though, I want to quickly outline the type of round that the government team has set up for you, or set up for us more appropriately, but for you to vote on. They're arguing that X has caused Y, in the case that social media has caused all their justifications. The problem is, no one disagrees with that cause and effect relationship. There's universal agreement that X has caused all of the Y factors and derivatives that they've outlined. What people disagree on is whether or not all of those effects of X are good or bad, and that could have been a meaningful, useful educational debate. But the government team didn't choose to do that, and so all their argumentation should be dismissed, and the resolution doesn't structure that debate, so all the government argumentation should be dismissed as well, giving the ballot to the opposition team. There's two voters that all of our argumentation boils down to. First, an improper interpretation by the government team, and an improper resolution to frame the debate. First, under improper resolution, the first and foremost issue is that of the value framework, coming from the idea of the phrase believes in the resolution. 4 points I want to leave you with on this. The comment, or it could mean many different things according to the government team, and that's very true, but none of the meanings or interpretations of believed in renders an immaterial feeling or sentiment into an inanimate object. That is, we believe in social media. You believe in the effect of, or the possibility of, or the inherent worth of something, but you don't believe in an object. That's simply grammatically and logically incorrect. Second, there needs to be conflict in a believes in resolution. There's not even any conflict of objects in this resolution. We believe in social media. That literally means nothing. There's no appropriate framework for this debate. Second, common language or normative language for debate. They said you have a limited framework. That's a bogus, that's basically a garbage response, because all resolutions across debate, or almost all resolutions universally are accepted as value when there's a believes in parameter set for the resolution. Fourthly, there's no reasons to prefer from the government team. We have given you throughout the resolution at least 4 different reasons to prefer why the value framework is true, and they've attempted to rebut some of them, but given no substantial reason why a fact is better, rather than a fact is good. And in his point of information, he said that, well, what material value or educational improvement is there on fact versus value? And the answer is, if they're appropriate, there's really none. But arguing value versus arguing against reality, there's a substantial educational deficit arguing against something that is universally accepted, as opposed to a more appropriate framework that should be arguing against what the resolution demands, that is, a value conflict. And the second point under improper interpretation is a truism. 2 points I want to leave you with under this. First, there is no dispute that social media has caused all the things they outlined. There simply isn't. There's only dispute on whether those are good or bad. They said, well, you could argue whether it's a fad or whether it's a long-term effect. But even in that hypothetical scenario, the effect has still happened. There's only disagreement on whether that's good or bad across all literature on the effects of social media on interaction, politics, the economy, and so forth. No disagreement on whether or not it's happened or not. Second, there's no possible debate against reality, and that's the most important one that I'm going to emphasize through both of these voters. Now, the second issue is an improper resolution. There's really 5 quick points I want to leave under the resolution of critique is what this voter centers around. First is John's quick comment of, well, this isn't really a critique. It's exactly a critique, even down to the very structure of the argumentation itself. So that off-the-cuff comment is just bogus. Second, the entire burden outlined in the critique, that of because of the value necessity imperative placed by the resolution on the government team, they need to show some value in social media rather than proving the existence of the effects or the value of the effects of social media, and they haven't done that. They didn't even address the burden that we outlined in our critique. The third point under this is the violations unaddressed. There was one main violation, that of improper wording, with 3 potent internal violations. None of those were fundamentally refuted by John in his speech. And third, but most importantly, or I guess is the fourth response, but the third unaddressed point of rhetoric or argumentation is that of the alternatives. We outlined 3 specific alternative resolutions that could have been argued and should have been argued instead of the improper or incomplete resolution and then improperly interpreted resolution that the government chose. None of those alternatives were addressed. John gave some half-baked alternatives for argumentation that he thinks we could have run, but in the end, those are still arguing against reality, and none of the alternatives that we addressed were refuted whatsoever. Thus, because of all of these 3 unaddressed points of argumentation in the critique, all of our impacts are still accessed, and that's the world the government team gives you at the end of this debate. An environment where debate kills the education, both individually as well as education for the body of knowledge surrounding whatever topic we're supposed to be debating, the effects of social media hypothetically, and it wastes our time. All negative argumentation, furthermore, the last point, all negative argumentation begs for a more complete resolution. They push for a resolution that argues the effect of social media rather than just believing in social media itself. So because of their argumentation, because of the improper resolution and their improper interpretation, this round automatically flows to the opposition team. Thank you.
I'm actually pretty pleased with myself. Apparently I presented a case that was so great that the negative team couldn't think of anything to argue against it, which makes me a little bit happy, but it makes me a little bit sad that you folks didn't even try. There are 3 things this round comes down to. 1, should this have been interpreted as a fact or a value? 2, did we interpret this truistically in order to deprive you of ground? And 3, the issues with your critique, and I'll throw in a 4th one relating to the impacts at the end of it. But let's just be clear that everybody agrees in this round that the resolution as we defined it, that social media has had a fundamental impact on society, is true. So let's first talk about fact versus value. If I were to tell you that little Virginia O'Hanlon believes in Santa Claus, you would assume that little Virginia O'Hanlon, my statement is saying that she believes Santa Claus exists. I'm not saying that little Virginia O'Hanlon desires or values Santa Claus. When I say I believe in God, I'm not necessarily in any way, shape, or form making a statement that I believe in the value of God. Rather, I'm saying God merely exists. It's a question of fact. We could say other statements, such as, I believe in Donald Trump's ability to win, or I believe in the faking of the moon landing. Those are all statements about the fact. The statement about Donald Trump is a statement about a fact having taken place in the future. The statement about the moon landing is a statement about a fact taking place in the past. In today's round, whether or not we're believing in social media, as we've defined it, we're debating about an event taking place in the past, and the word believes in does not remove that at all from the ground in this round. Now, we could talk about believing in love, or security, or believing in some sort of a value, in which case this would very clearly be a value round because we'd be talking about believing in the value of that thing. We could have defined this as a value. If we had defined this as a value round, we would be debating whether or not the effects of social media are good. However, I think that whether or not the effects of social media actually are important at all hasn't been established firmly enough for us to have a meaningful debate over whether or not those effects are a good thing or a bad thing. I think that there is a ton of ground, moving into our second voting issue, the issue of truism, as to whether or not there have been fundamental or important changes in society as the result of social media. So before we get into this, what those arguments would be, because you may not believe me, you may think that my case was so good that you can't think of anything either. But before I get into that, let's talk about some other things. Metaphors are way worse for you guys' prep time than this. You guys knew we would be debating social media. Most of the arguments you could have come up with against why social media is good, like we're talking in the first one about how people can live far away from home now, the arguments that you would have come up against that could have been used in this round. You didn't use them. You had way more ability to prep in your prep time than you would have in any metaphor round at all. Secondly, let's look at the arguments you guys could have made that you didn't. Firstly, I talked about the interpersonal sphere of society. People still hate being really far away from home. That's just a fact. You haven't fundamentally changed the fact that people do want to live near home. Secondly, people still go to bars and go to churches in order to meet the vast majority of their friends. The people who are online, who they're meeting with on Facebook, like we talked about, are not their primary group of friends, nor will they ever be, most likely. Thirdly, we talked about cyberbullying. You guys could have come up here and said, hey, guess what? Cyberbullying, what is that? Bullying has just been bad forever. Bullying is in no way fundamentally different than it ever was. People have always been having significant problems with this. You guys didn't argue any of that. When it came to economics, what did I argue in economics? With economics, I argued that direct marketing has fundamentally changed things. You guys could have got up here and say, guess what, folks? In fact, in today's world, the vast majority of money spent on marketing is still spent on traditional types of advertising, like commercials, not on social media campaigns. So why are we to believe that social media campaigns are more important? Very easy thing to argue. You could have argued that it's way easier to make a good TV ad than a great social media campaign. And all of those arguments could have been cross-applied to our politics point. People have been saying for ages that all politics is local. Grassroots politicking isn't any more important than it is back then. Obama just won because he's a charismatic person. Not anything because he was better at social media. He's just super charismatic. You could have made all these arguments. You could have also argued that this isn't social media, this is the internet. But you didn't. This round, the statement was, has X caused Y? Has social media caused those things? You could have argued, have those things happened? Most of them haven't. People still don't want to live far away from home. Politics hasn't fundamentally changed. You could have argued, has X actually been the cause of Y? My partner gave you a bunch of examples of other things that could have caused this stuff. I could bring up more if you want. You could talk about shifting demographics, the youth becoming involved. All these other things as being more important. You could have argued that Y isn't a fundamental or big enough change. That was all ground we outlined for you guys in our first speech under our definitions. Third voting issue, the critique. We didn't write this res, we shouldn't be responsible for the fact that it wasn't clear enough for you guys. Secondly, the res is a lot more specific than a lot of other reses, like metaphors in particular. Thirdly, all you guys had to do was prep out arguments for both the fact version of this and the value version of this, which both were very, very predictable. Final voting issue, education. Who is deprived of an education in this round, them or us? They're the ones who didn't come up here and talk about anything relating to social media, which was the topic assigned in this round. We came up here and talked about a lot of things relating to social media, including in this last speech where I kind of did my best to demolish my own case in 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Judge. I think it's clear this isn't a truism, that this should have been interpreted as a fact, and finally that it didn't decrease educational value. Thank you.